The alarm didn't go off. Or maybe it did, and Claire Mathison simply didn't hear it through the fog of exhaustion that had settled over her like a second skin. She opened her eyes to the pale gray light filtering through the curtains of their bedroom in the small house on Maple Grove Lane, and for a moment, she lay perfectly still, listening. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels like absence rather than peace. She turned her head slowly toward the other side of the bed. The sheets were cold, the pillow still holding the faint impression of where David's head had been hours ago. He was already gone. She shouldn't have been surprised. He'd been leaving earlier and earlier for the past few months, mumbling something about morning meetings or traffic or needing to stop by the gym. She stopped asking. The answers never quite added up anyway, and she'd grown tired of the way his eyes would flicker away from hers when he spoke, as if the truth was something shameful he couldn't bear to let her see. Claire sat up slowly, her body heavy with something that felt like grief but had no name. Today was her birthday, 34 years old. She had imagined waking up to flowers on the nightstand, maybe breakfast in bed, or at the very least, a kiss on the forehead and a whispered happy birthday before David left for work. She had imagined wrong. She walked barefoot across the hardwood floor, her feet cold against the wood, and made her way to the kitchen. The coffee maker sat empty and dark. No note on the counter. No card propped against the sugar bowl. No sign that this day was any different from the hundreds that had come before it. She filled the machine with water and grounds, her hands moving through the motions with mechanical precision, and while it brewed, she stood at the window looking out at the street where nothing moved except a single crow, picking at something in the gutter. Her phone sat on the counter, screen dark. She picked it up, unlocked it, and scrolled through her notifications. A spam email, a reminder about a dentist appointment next week, a promotional text from the grocery store. Nothing from David. She opened their text thread and saw the last message she'd sent him 2 days ago asking if he'd be home for dinner. He'd responded with a thumbs-up emoji. That was all. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, the one they'd bought together at a yard sale when they first got married, back when everything still felt like an adventure. The chair creaked under her weight. The house settled around her with small groans and sighs, and she realized with a sinking clarity that she had been waiting for the door to open, waiting for him to walk in with a sheepish grin and a bouquet of daisies, her favorite, and say he was just teasing her, that he could never forget, that she was the most important thing in his world. But the door didn't open. The house remained silent. And Claire sat there with her coffee growing cold between her hands, feeling the weight of something breaking inside her that she didn't yet have the words to name. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something deeper and more corrosive. It was the slow, terrible realization that she had become invisible in her own life, that the man she had chosen to build a future with had somehow stopped seeing her altogether. And the worst part, the part that made her throat tighten and her eyes burn, was that she wasn't even sure when it had happened. When had she become someone so easy to forget? The day unfolded with cruel normalcy. Claire showered, dressed, and drove to the library where she worked as an assistant cataloging books and helping patrons find what they were looking for. She smiled at familiar faces, scanned barcodes, shelved returns, and pretended that everything was fine. No one asked if it was her birthday. She hadn't told anyone. What was the point? Birthdays had become just another day, unmarked and unremarkable, and she had learned not to expect anything different. During her lunch break, she sat alone in the small staff room with a sandwich she'd made that morning and checked her phone again. Still nothing from David, but as she scrolled through social media, something caught her eye. A notification. David had been tagged in a photo. Her thumb hesitated over the screen before she tapped it open. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, and when it finally resolved, Claire felt the air leave her lungs. It was a picture from a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with cloth napkins and candlelight. David sat at a table across from a woman Claire had never seen before. She was young, maybe late 20s, with long, dark hair and a bright smile. They were both laughing, their faces close together, and on the table between them sat 2 glasses of wine and a dessert, with a single candle stuck in the center. The caption read, "Best surprise lunch ever. Thank you, babe." Claire stared at the screen until the image blurred. Her hands were shaking. She read the caption again. slower this time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Babe. The woman had called him Babe. And there, in the background of the photo, barely visible but unmistakable, was a small gift bag with tissue paper spilling out of the top. He had bought her a gift. He had taken her to lunch. He had celebrated something with her. But not with Claire. Not on her birthday. She closed the app and locked her phone, setting it face down on the table as if that could somehow undo what she'd just seen. Her sandwich sat untouched in front of her, and she realized she couldn't eat, couldn't breathe properly. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. And somewhere in the building, a door slammed shut. She pressed her palms flat against the table and tried to steady herself, tried to think through the noise in her head. It wasn't just that he'd forgotten. It was that he'd remembered someone else, that he'd made time, made plans, bought a gift, shown up, for her, whoever she was. And Claire, who had woken up alone and spent the day pretending not to care, felt something sharp and jagged lodge itself in her chest. When her shift ended, she drove home in a daze, barely registering the roads or the stoplights or the other cars around her. She pulled into the driveway and sat there for a long time with the engine off, staring at the house that no longer felt like hers. Inside, everything would look the same. The furniture they'd chosen together, the photos on the walls, the life they'd built. But it was all a lie now, wasn't it? A performance, a hollow shell. She finally went inside and moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching things without really seeing them. She opened the refrigerator and found the small cake she'd bought for herself yesterday, a single-layer vanilla cake from the grocery store bakery. It sat on the shelf, plain and sad, and she realized with a bitter clarity that she had known. Some part of her had known he wouldn't remember, so she'd bought her own cake. She'd planned her own small, private celebration, because deep down, she'd already accepted that she didn't matter enough to him anymore. Claire closed the refrigerator and walked to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her phone, at the photo still burned into her mind, and for the first time all day, she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not just the forgetting, but the replacing, the choosing of someone else, the deliberate, conscious act of giving his attention, his time, his affection to another woman while his wife sat alone and unseen. It wasn't just a forgotten birthday. It was a message, and Claire had finally received it. David came home just after 11 that night. Claire heard the car door slam in the driveway, then the jingle of his keys as he fumbled with the lock. She was sitting in the living room with all the lights off, except for the small lamp by the couch, its weak glow casting long shadows across the walls. She'd been sitting there for hours, waiting, her hands folded in her lap, her mind cycling through 1,000 different conversations she might have with him. But now that he was actually here, walking through the door with his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled, all those carefully rehearsed words disappeared. He didn't notice her at first. He dropped his keys on the hall table with a clatter and kicked off his shoes, leaving them in a careless pile by the door. Then he looked up and startled slightly when he saw her sitting there in the dimness. "Jesus, Claire, you scared me." His voice was rough, edged with irritation, and she could smell the alcohol on him even from across the room. Whiskey, maybe, or bourbon. Something strong enough to loosen his movements and slur his words just slightly. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, this man she'd married 7 years ago, and tried to find traces of the person she'd fallen in love with, the one who used to bring her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, the one who used to hold her hand in movie theaters and kiss her forehead when she was stressed. She couldn't find him. That man had been replaced by this stranger, who stumbled through the door at 11 at night smelling like someone else's perfume. "Do you know what today was?" Her voice came out quieter than she intended, barely more than a whisper. David squinted at her, his face creasing in confusion. "What? Today? Do you know what day it was?" He shrugged and ran a hand through his hair, clearly annoyed at being interrogated. "Friday? It was my birthday, David." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. She watched his face carefully, looking for some flicker of recognition, some sign of remorse or surprise. But there was nothing, just a blank, slightly irritated stare. And then, after a long moment, he laughed, a short, dismissive bark of laughter that cut through her like broken glass. "It's just a birthday, Claire. You're acting like I committed a crime." She felt something cold settle in her chest, something that felt like the final thread of hope snapping. You forgot. So what? People forget things. I've been busy. Work has been insane, and He stopped himself, his eyes darting away from hers. And in that split second of hesitation, Claire saw it, the lie forming before he even spoke it. I had a client dinner tonight. It ran late. I'm sorry, okay? I'll make it up to you. A client dinner, she repeated slowly, tasting the words. They felt like ash in her mouth. Yeah, what's with the interrogation? She stood up then, her legs unsteady beneath her, and pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking as she opened the photo and held it out to him. Is that what this was? A client dinner? David's face went pale. For the first time that night, she saw something real in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. More like panic. The look of someone who'd been caught and was rapidly calculating how to talk his way out of it. Where did you get that? You were tagged. She posted it. Everyone can see it. Claire's voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath it now. Something sharp and serrated. You took her out. You bought her a gift. You celebrated with her, but you couldn't even send me a text message. It's not what you think. Then what is it? He opened his mouth, closed it, then ran both hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration. She's just... Look, it's complicated, okay? You wouldn't understand. Try me. Claire, come on, don't do this. You're being ridiculous. The word hit her like a slap. Ridiculous. As if her pain was something trivial. As if the fact that her husband had spent her birthday with another woman was just an overreaction on her part. She looked at him standing there in their living room, swaying slightly, his eyes bloodshot and evasive, and she realized with brutal clarity that he wasn't sorry. He was just annoyed that he'd been caught. Get out, she said softly. What? Get out. Sleep on the couch. Sleep in your car. I don't care. But don't come into our bedroom tonight. David stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as if he wanted to argue. But something in her face must have stopped him. He grabbed a pillow from the couch and a throw blanket from the chair and walked toward the guest room without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Claire stood alone in the living room, her phone still clutched in her hand, feeling the full weight of everything that had just shattered. The days that followed blurred together into a gray, shapeless mass. Claire went through the motions of living because she didn't know what else to do. She woke up, she showered, she dressed, she went to work, she came home. She made dinner that neither of them ate. She slept, or tried to, in a bed that felt too big and too cold. Even with David lying on the far edge, his back turned to her, the space between them a chasm that neither of them tried to cross. They didn't talk about that night. David acted as if it had never happened, as if she'd never confronted him, as if the photo and the other woman and the forgotten birthday were all just figments of her imagination. He moved through the house like a tenant, polite and distant, asking her to pass the salt at dinner, or letting her know he'd be working late again, always working late. And Claire said nothing, because what was there to say? She'd already said it all, and he'd made it clear that her feelings were an inconvenience he didn't have the patience to deal with. She stopped checking his phone, stopped looking at social media, stopped torturing herself with evidence of a truth she already knew. Instead, she turned inward, folding into herself like a piece of paper creased too many times. She cried in the shower where the sound of the water could drown out her sobs. She stared at herself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her eyes were hollow. Her skin was pale. She looked like someone who was disappearing. At work, she moved through her tasks mechanically, shelving books and helping patrons with a smile that felt like a mask glued to her face. Her coworkers noticed something was wrong. Janet from circulation asked if she was feeling okay. Marcus from reference brought her tea and told her she could talk to him if she needed to. But Claire just thanked them and changed the subject, because how could she explain what was happening when she didn't fully understand it herself? How could she put into words the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being married to someone who no longer sees you? She started skipping meals. Not intentionally at first, but she just wasn't hungry anymore. Food tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing. She'd sit at the kitchen table with a plate of something she'd microwaved and push it around with her fork until it was cold, then scrape it into the trash and tell herself she'd eat tomorrow. Tomorrow she'd feel better. Tomorrow she'd have an appetite. But tomorrow came, and nothing changed. The worst part was the shame, the deep, gnawing shame that settled in her bones and whispered to her in the quiet moments. This is your fault. You weren't enough. You let yourself go. You became boring. You stopped trying. The voice in her head sounded like her mother, like her ex-boyfriend from college, like every cruel comment she'd ever internalized and carried with her. And now it sounded like David, too. Even though he'd never said those words out loud, he didn't have to. His actions said them for him. She avoided mirrors, avoided reflections in windows, avoided anything that might force her to confront what she'd become, because she knew what she'd see. A woman who'd been erased. A woman who'd let herself be erased. And the knowledge of that, the complicity in her own disappearance, was almost worse than the betrayal itself. At night, she lay awake listening to David breathe beside her, his sleep deep and unbothered while hers was fractured and restless. She'd stare at the ceiling and think about how easy it would be to just stop. Stop trying. Stop caring. Stop existing in this half-life where she was present but not really there. She didn't want to die. Exactly. She just wanted to stop feeling this way. Wanted to stop hurting. Wanted to wake up one morning and discover that none of this had been real. That it was all just a terrible dream she could shake off and forget. But morning always came, and nothing had changed. The house was still cold. David was still distant, and Claire was still drowning in a marriage that had become a slow, quiet kind of death. The kind nobody notices until it's too late. The kind that doesn't leave bruises or scars you can point to and say, "Here, this is where it hurt." It just hollows you out from the inside until there's nothing left but an echo of who you used to be. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late October. Claire woke before dawn to the sound of rain drumming against the windows. A steady, relentless rhythm that matched the hollow beating of her heart. David was already gone. His side of the bed was cold, the sheets barely disturbed, as if he'd never been there at all. She lay there for a long time, listening to the rain and feeling something inside her shift, something fundamental and irreversible, like tectonic plates finally giving way after years of pressure. She didn't cry. She'd run out of tears weeks ago. Instead, she felt a strange, crystalline clarity settle over her, sharp and bright and utterly calm. This was it. The moment she stopped waiting for things to get better. The moment she stopped believing that love could survive on memory alone. The moment she chose herself. Claire rose from the bed and moved through the house with quiet purpose. She pulled a small suitcase from the hall closet, the one they'd bought for weekend trips they never took anymore, and laid it open on the bedroom floor. She packed methodically, without sentiment, jeans, sweaters, underwear, socks, a few shirts, her toiletries from the bathroom, the book on her nightstand. Nothing that would be missed. Nothing that screamed goodbye. Just enough to survive. She opened her jewelry box and looked at the pieces David had given her over the years. The pearl earrings for their first anniversary, the silver bracelet for her 30th birthday, the necklace he'd chosen when he still cared about choosing things for her. She left them all. She only took the pieces that had belonged to her grandmother, the ones that held memories from before David, from a time when she'd still known who she was. In the kitchen, she made herself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter drinking it slowly, watching the rain streak down the window. The house was so quiet. It had always been quiet, she realized, even when both of them were home. The silence wasn't new. She'd just stopped noticing it somewhere along the way, had learned to fill it with excuses and hope, and the belief that things would eventually change, but they hadn't changed. He hadn't changed, and she couldn't keep living in this tomb of a marriage, waiting for a resurrection that would never come. She finished her coffee and washed the cup, drying it carefully and placing it back in the cabinet. Then she took off her wedding ring. It slid off easily, too easily, and she realized with a dull ache that she'd lost weight, that the ring had been loose for weeks, and she hadn't even noticed. She set it on the kitchen table, right in the center where he'd see it when he came home. She didn't leave a note. What would she say? That she was tired of being invisible? That she couldn't watch him choose someone else over her one more time? That loving him had become the loneliest thing she'd ever done? He already knew all of that, or he should have. And if he didn't, then no note would make him understand. Claire picked up her suitcase and walked to the front door. She paused there for a moment, her hand on the doorknob, and looked back at the house one last time. The couch where they used to watch movies together. The dining table where they'd eaten 1,000 meals. The photographs on the walls documenting a life that had stopped feeling real, somewhere along the way. She wasn't running away, she told herself. She was walking toward something. Toward air, toward light, toward the possibility of feeling like a whole person again instead of a ghost haunting her own life. She opened the door and stepped out into the rain. It soaked through her coat immediately, cold and shocking, but she didn't care. She threw her suitcase into the back seat of her car and climbed behind the wheel, her hands shaking as she started the engine. She didn't know where she was going, didn't have a plan, didn't have a destination. She just drove, windshield wipers beating against the downpour. The road ahead of her blurred and uncertain, but somehow less frightening than the life she was leaving behind. Claire ended up in a town called Millbrook, 40 miles west of the city, where she'd spent the last 7 years of her life. She didn't choose it for any particular reason, except that she'd been driving until her gas tank was nearly empty, and Millbrook was where she happened to stop. It was small, the kind of place where everyone probably knew everyone else, with a main street lined with brick buildings and trees that were shedding their leaves in drifts of red and gold. She found a motel on the edge of town, a tired-looking place with a flickering neon sign that read, "Vacancy," in pink letters, and paid for a week in cash. The room was small and plain, with faded floral wallpaper and a bed that sagged in the middle, but it was clean and quiet and hers. She set her suitcase on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall across from her, and felt nothing. Not relief, not fear, just a vast echoing emptiness where her life used to be. The days blurred together. She extended her stay at the motel week by week, paying cash from the small savings account David didn't know about, the one she'd opened years ago with money from her grandmother's estate. She didn't call anyone, didn't tell anyone where she was. She turned off her phone and left it in the drawer of the nightstand, silenced and forgotten. She didn't want to see the messages, didn't want to know if David had even noticed she was gone. She found work at a small diner on Main Street called Rosie's. The owner, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and kind eyes, hired her on the spot when Claire walked in and asked if they needed help. No questions, no background check. Just an apron and a shift schedule, and a quiet understanding that sometimes people needed a fresh start, and it wasn't anyone's business why. The work was mindless and exhausting, in a way that felt almost good. She took orders and poured coffee and wiped down tables, and at the end of each shift her feet ached and her back hurt, and she fell into bed too tired to think. That was what she wanted. To be too tired to think. Too tired to remember. Too tired to feel the weight of everything she'd left behind pressing down on her chest. She moved out of the motel after a month and found a small studio apartment above a hardware store. The rent was cheap and the place was drafty, with a radiator that clanked and hissed through the night, but it had a window that looked out over the street and a door she could lock, and that was enough. She bought secondhand furniture from a thrift store and filled the tiny kitchen with mismatched plates and cups. She hung no pictures, kept no photographs. She wanted the space to be blank, a place with no history, no memories, no ghosts. People in Millbrook were kind in that distant, respectful way that small-town people can be with strangers. They nodded at her on the street, made small talk while she refilled their coffee, asked how she was settling in without prying into where she'd come from or why. She told them her name was Claire, and nothing more, and they seemed to understand that was all she had to offer. At night, alone in her apartment, she would stand at the window and watch the town settle into darkness, streetlights flickering on, cars pulling into driveways, families visible through lit windows, moving around their kitchens and living rooms in the comfortable choreography of people who belonged somewhere. And Claire would stand there on the outside looking in, feeling like a shadow, like something that existed in the margins of other people's lives, but had no substance of its own. She wasn't healing. She knew that. She was just surviving, just breathing in and out and moving from one day to the next, without any real purpose or direction. She was empty, hollowed out, a shell going through motions. But maybe that was okay. Maybe that was all she could manage right now. Maybe healing would come later, or maybe it wouldn't. And either way, she would still wake up tomorrow and go to work and pour coffee and wipe down tables and pretend that this half-life was enough. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early December when Claire first really noticed him. The diner was quiet, the lunch rush long over, and she was refilling salt shakers at the counter when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up out of habit and saw a man walk in, stamping snow from his boots and unwinding a dark scarf from around his neck. He was tall, maybe in his early 40s, with graying hair at his temples and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. But he wasn't smiling now. He looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying too much for too long. He took a seat at the counter, 2 stools down from where she was working, and pulled off his gloves. Claire grabbed a menu and a glass of water and set them in front of him without really looking at his face. She'd gotten good at that over the past few months, at seeing people without actually seeing them, at moving through interactions like a ghost. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat and automatic. "Please." His voice was quiet, hoarse, like he hadn't used it much that day. "Black is fine." She poured him a cup and turned to go, but he spoke again before she could walk away. "Claire?" She froze. The sound of her name in his mouth was startling, unfamiliar, and for a moment she couldn't place why. Then she looked at him, really looked, and something in her memory shifted. The shape of his face, the way he held himself, the faint scar above his left eyebrow. "Ethan?" The name came out uncertain, disbelieving. "Yeah." He smiled then, a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's been a long time." Ethan Crowley. She hadn't seen him in over a decade. Not since they'd both worked at the library back in the city, back when she was fresh out of college and he was finishing his graduate degree. They'd been friends. The kind of friends who got coffee between shifts and talked about books and movies and what they wanted from life. He'd left town for a teaching position in Boston, and they'd lost touch the way people do when distance and time pull them in different directions. "What are you doing here?" She was still holding the coffee pot, her hand trembling slightly. "I could ask you the same thing." He wrapped his hands around the mug, as if drawing warmth from it. "I moved back about 6 months ago. Got a job teaching at the community college. And you?" She hesitated. The truth felt too heavy, too complicated to unpack in the middle of a diner with Rosie watching from the kitchen and the overhead lights humming their fluorescent song. "I'm just here," she said finally. "Working, living." He nodded slowly, his eyes searching her face in a way that made her want to look away. "You look different." "So do you." "Yeah." He took a sip of his coffee, and she saw his hand shake slightly as he set the mug down. Life has a way of doing that to people. There was something in his voice, some undercurrent of pain that she recognized because she carried the same thing inside herself. She wanted to ask what had happened to him, what had put those shadows in his eyes and that weariness in his shoulders, but she didn't. Instead, she refilled his coffee without being asked and moved down the counter to tend to another customer who'd just walked in. But she felt him watching her as she worked, felt the weight of his gaze following her movements, and it unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name. Not because it was intrusive or uncomfortable, but because it was kind. Because when Ethan looked at her, she had the strange, disorienting sensation of being seen. Really seen. Not as a waitress or a ghost or a hollow shell going through motions, but as a person, as Claire, and she'd forgotten what that felt like. He stayed for over an hour, nursing his coffee and picking at a piece of pie he'd ordered but barely touched. When he finally stood to leave, he pulled out his wallet and left a $20 bill on the counter, far more than the meal cost. Then he looked at her one more time, and there was something in his expression that made her chest tighten. "It's good to see you, Claire," he said quietly. "Really good." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and watched him walk out into the snow. The bell above the door chimed again, and then he was gone, and the diner felt emptier somehow, colder, as if his presence had been the only warm thing in it. Rosie came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Friend of yours?" "Used to be," Claire said softly. "A long time ago." "He'll be back," Rosie said, with the quiet certainty of someone who'd seen enough of life to recognize patterns. Men like that always come back. Claire didn't respond. She just picked up the $20 bill and folded it carefully, slipping it into her apron pocket, and tried not to think about why her hands were shaking. Ethan did come back. The next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. He came in around 2 in the afternoon, when the lunch crowd had thinned, and took the same seat at the counter, always ordering coffee, and sometimes a sandwich he never quite finished. At first, Claire thought it was coincidence, that he just happened to be in the area, but by the end of the first week she understood that he was coming to see her. Not in any overbearing or uncomfortable way. He didn't ask her questions about where she'd been or why she'd ended up in Millbrook. He just showed up, quietly, consistently, and existed in her orbit, like a steady, undemanding presence. He started bringing things. Small things. A paperback novel he thought she might like. Its spine creased from where he'd read it himself. A packet of the good tea from the specialty shop downtown, because he'd heard her mention once that the diner's tea tasted like dishwater. A pair of wool gloves when he noticed her hands were chapped and red from the cold walk to work. He never made a big deal of it, never waited for thanks or acknowledgement. He just set the item on the counter with a quiet, "Thought you might need this," and changed the subject before she could protest. Claire didn't know what to do with his kindness. It confused her, disarmed her, made her want to build walls and tear them down at the same time. She'd spent so long being invisible that being noticed felt almost painful, like light on eyes that had adjusted to darkness. But Ethan was patient. He didn't push. He just kept showing up. One afternoon in mid-December, she asked him why. They were alone in the diner, the windows fogged with condensation and the radiator hissing in the corner. Ethan was reading a book, his coffee growing cold beside him, and Claire was supposed to be wiping down tables, but instead found herself standing across from him, the question burning in her throat. "Why do you keep coming here?" He looked up from his book, surprised. "The coffee's terrible and the pie's mediocre, but the company's worth it. I'm serious." He closed the book slowly, marking his place with a napkin. "So am I." "Ethan." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the cover of the book. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "Because I know what it's like to feel like you're drowning, and I know what it's like when someone throws you a rope, even if you're not ready to grab it yet. So I'm just here. That's all. I didn't ask for a rope." "I know." He smiled, sad and understanding. "But I'm offering one anyway. No pressure, no strings. Just, if you ever want to grab it, it's there." Claire felt something crack inside her, some carefully constructed barrier she'd been holding in place for months. Her eyes burned and her throat tightened, and she turned away quickly, busying herself with straightening menus that didn't need straightening. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't let anyone in right now. I'm too broken." "You're not broken." His voice was firm, cutting through her spiral. "You're hurt. There's a difference." She wanted to argue, wanted to explain that he didn't understand, that she was empty and hollow, and had nothing left to give anyone. But before she could speak, the bell above the door chimed, and a group of customers walked in, shattering the moment. Claire straightened, wiping her eyes quickly, and went to take their orders. When she glanced back at Ethan, he'd returned to his book, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set, and she knew he'd seen her tears. That night, as she walked home through the snow, she found herself thinking about what he'd said, about ropes and drowning and the difference between broken and hurt. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone. Claire woke on her 35th birthday to complete silence. No alarm, no rain against the windows, just the pale winter light filtering through the thin curtains of her studio apartment and the distant sound of someone shoveling snow on the street below. She lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, and waited for the familiar ache to settle in her chest. The reminder of last year, the forgotten cake, the photo of David with another woman, the crushing weight of invisibility. But the ache didn't come. Or rather, it came differently, softer, like an old wound that had finally started to scar over. She was still sad, still carrying the heaviness of everything she'd lost, but somewhere in the months of silence and solitude and small acts of survival, something had shifted. She wasn't the same woman who'd left her wedding ring on that kitchen table. She didn't know yet who she was becoming, but she knew she was no longer dissolving. She got up and made coffee in the small French press Ethan had given her 2 weeks ago, another one of his quiet, unasked-for gifts. The coffee was strong and bitter and good, and she drank it standing at the window, watching the town wake up beneath a blanket of fresh snow. She had a shift at the diner starting at noon. Nothing special planned. No expectations, and that felt okay. better than okay. It felt like peace. The diner was busy when she arrived, the morning crowd lingering over their eggs and hash browns, reluctant to head back out into the cold. Claire tied on her apron and fell into the rhythm of work, taking orders and pouring coffee and moving through the controlled chaos with practiced efficiency. She didn't think about her birthday, didn't dwell on it. It was just another day, and after last year that felt like a gift in itself. Ethan came in at his usual time, just after 2, when the diner had emptied out, and the only sounds were the hiss of the radiator and the clatter of dishes being washed in the back. He took his usual seat at the counter, unwinding his scarf and shaking snow from his hair, and Claire poured him coffee without being asked. "Busy day?" he asked, warming his hands on the mug. "The usual." She wiped down the counter, her movements automatic. "How was your morning?" "Graded papers. Broke up a debate about Hemingway versus Fitzgerald, the standard academic warfare." He smiled, but there was something else in his expression, something nervous and uncertain that she couldn't quite read. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something." She looked up, curious. "Okay, do you have plans tonight?" The question caught her off guard. "Plans?" "Yeah, like dinner plans. Or any plans." He was fumbling now, his usual calm composure slipping. "I thought maybe we could get dinner. If you want. There's a place on the edge of town, nothing fancy, but they make a decent lasagna, and I just thought—" He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair. "Sorry, I'm not good at this. I just thought you might not want to spend tonight alone." Claire felt her chest tighten. "How did you know?" "Know what?" "That it's my birthday." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "It is?" He let out a breath, half laugh, half disbelief. "I didn't know. I swear, I had a feeling you might need company tonight. That's all." She stared at him, this man who kept showing up, who kept offering kindness without asking for anything in return, who somehow sensed when she needed someone even when she didn't say it out loud, and something inside her, some tightly held fear, loosened its grip. "Okay," she said softly. "Dinner sounds good." The restaurant was small and warm, tucked into a converted house with mismatched furniture and candles on every table. They sat by the window overlooking the snow-covered street, and Ethan ordered lasagna for both of them and a bottle of red wine that the waitress poured into glasses that didn't quite match. They talked about small things at first, books they'd read, movies they'd seen, the strangeness of winter in small towns. But as the evening wore on, and the wine loosened the edges of their carefully maintained boundaries, the conversation deepened. Ethan told her about his divorce, about the wife who'd left him for someone else, about the years he'd spent trying to outrun the pain by throwing himself into work, into new cities, into anything that would keep him from having to feel. He told her about moving back to Millbrook because he'd finally realized that running didn't work, that the only way through grief was straight through the middle of it. And Claire, surprising herself, told him everything about David, about the forgotten birthday and the other woman, and the slow, suffocating death of her marriage, about leaving in the rain with no plan and no destination, about the months of emptiness and the fear that she'd never feel whole again. When she finished, Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm, his grip gentle but steady. "You're one of the bravest people I know," he said quietly. "I don't feel brave. I feel like I'm barely holding it together." That's what bravery is, holding it together when everything's falling apart. They sat there in the flickering candlelight, hands linked across the table, and Claire felt something she hadn't felt in over a year. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The small, fragile hope that maybe she could open herself up again without being destroyed. When they left the restaurant, Ethan walked her home through the snow-quiet streets. At her door, he pulled something from his coat pocket. A small bakery box tied with string. "I stopped by the bakery this afternoon," he said, almost sheepish. "I didn't know it was your birthday, but I'm glad I got it anyway." Claire opened the box. Inside was a single cupcake with vanilla frosting and one candle pressed into the top. Her eyes filled with tears. They sat on the floor of Claire's apartment with the cupcake between them, the candle casting dancing shadows on the walls. Ethan had lit it with a match from the box he kept in his pocket, and now they both stared at the small flame as if it held some kind of answer. "Make a wish," Ethan said softly. Claire looked at the candle, at the tiny point of light wavering in the darkness. and realized she didn't know what to wish for. A year ago, she would have wished to go back, to fix her marriage, to be enough for David, to make him see her again. But now, sitting here in this small apartment with this kind man who'd shown up when she needed someone most, she understood that going back wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want to be that woman anymore, the one who made herself small, the one who waited to be chosen. She closed her eyes and made her wish, not for David to come back, not for the past to be different, but for the courage to keep moving forward, to keep choosing herself, to believe that she was worthy of love, not because someone gave it to her, but because she'd learned to give it to herself. She blew out the candle. Ethan smiled and split the cupcake in half, handing her the larger piece. They ate in comfortable silence, the frosting too sweet and the cake a little dry. But it was the best thing Claire had tasted in months, because it wasn't something she'd bought for herself in a grocery store out of resignation. It was a gift, a gesture, a reminder that she mattered. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For this, for all of it, for not giving up on me when I'd given up on myself." "You never gave up," Ethan said. "You just needed time to find your way back. I don't know if I'm back yet. You don't have to be. There's no timeline for healing." Claire looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone who understood, who'd been where she was, who'd survived his own kind of drowning and learned to breathe again. And she realized that maybe that was what love was supposed to be, not fireworks and grand gestures and desperate need, but this, quiet understanding, patient kindness, someone who saw you at your worst and didn't run away. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, "how to let someone in again. You don't have to know. We'll figure it out together, one day at a time." She nodded, tears streaming down her face now, all the grief and pain and relief she'd been holding finally breaking free. Ethan moved closer and pulled her into his arms, and she let herself collapse against him, sobbing into his shoulder while he held her, and didn't try to fix anything, didn't tell her it would be okay. Just let her feel everything she needed to feel. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled back and wiped her eyes. "I'm a mess. You're human." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And for what it's worth, I think you're extraordinary." Claire laughed, a wet, broken sound. "I'm really not. You are to me." They stayed up late talking, about everything and nothing, about the past and the future, and the strange, unexpected way their lives had intersected again after all these years. And when Ethan finally left, promising to see her tomorrow at the diner, Claire stood at her window and watched him walk down the snow-covered street until he disappeared around the corner. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass. The woman staring back at her was thin and tired, with shadows under her eyes and lines of pain etched into her face. But there was something else there, too. Something she hadn't seen in a long time. A spark, a flicker of life, the beginnings of hope. David had forgotten her, had erased her, had made her feel like she didn't matter. But Ethan had remembered, had seen her, had shown her that she was worth showing up for. And in doing that, he'd given her something more valuable than love. He'd given her back herself. Claire didn't know what would happen next. Didn't know if she and Ethan would build something real or if this was just a moment of comfort in the middle of chaos. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never again wait for someone to choose her. She would never again make herself small to fit into someone else's life. She had learned, finally, that the only person who needed to see her worth was herself, and that was enough. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that it's never too late to find yourself again after being lost, subscribe to this channel, because every week, I share stories of women who walked through fire and came out stronger on the other side. Women who learned that being forgotten by the wrong person is sometimes the first step toward being found by the right one.